start. Pierre and I would like to welcome everybody to this dialogue on neuroscience, culture and cognition. The dialogue is organized in context of the NWO Horizon program, Knowledge and Culture, in which we, that is the team, explore the relation between core knowledge systems and culture. And this research raised the question of the relation between cognitive capacities for music, number, geometry, language and aesthetics that are studied in cognitive sciences, for example, in developmental psychology, psycholinguistics, numerical cognition, and many other subfields, on the one hand. And then there's the question, of course, of the neural substrate of these capacities on the other, neural capacities in the neural substrate in the brain on the other. And it's in this context that we have invited Jean-Pierre Changeux, Randy Galistel, and Virginie van Wassenhoven to discuss fundamental issues related to the nature of cognition and neuroscience and the question of what part of culture is related to cognition and what part is determined by the neural substrate. And now I'll let Pierre introduce the speakers.
Good afternoon. I'm going to introduce the speakers. Jean-Pierre Changeux obtained his PhD from the Institut Pasteur under the direction of Jacques Monod and François Jacob in 1964. He then went to the University of California in Berkeley from 1965 to 1966, and then to Columbia Universities in 1967, before coming back to France to work at the Pasteur Institute in 1972, where he obtained a professorship in 1975. He was elected at the Collège de France, where he holds a share of cell communication since 2006. Professor Changeux' most distinguished achievement is perhaps his innovative work on the transmission of information in the nervous system. More precisely, the transmission of information between nerve and muscles. This work isolated for the first time a receptor in electric organs in muscles and nerves. This work has illuminated the transmission of information through a family of receptors through different systems of the nervous system. It has implications for our understanding of change of connectivity in the nervous system, and particularly to changes of connectivity in the nervous system, the selective pruning and loss of connection that allows to refine the capacities of the brain. He has more recently expanded his interest to cognitive science with many contributions ranging from the nature of bird songs to the nature of consciousness. He has written many books on various topics such as l'homme neuronal, mind, matters and mathematics, raison and plaisir, aesthetics and the arts. Jean-Pierre played a huge role in the dissemination of ideas in France. He created, together with Dan Sperber and others, the Centre de Royaumont and participated to the Piaget-Chomsky debate. He also participated in the Lawrence Center-Nias workshop on core knowledge, language and culture, organized by Johan Röhrig and myself in 2012 here in Leiden. His interest also extends to art, aesthetics, and Jean-Pierre has also chaired the Interministerial Commission for the Conservation of the French Artistic Heritage since 1989 and has been a member of the Scientific Council of the International Agency of Museums since 2007. He is presently the co-chairman of the Ethics and Society Division of the European Brain Programme.
Thank you very much. I think you can remove the light because oh yes, this one. Much better. Okay, even though the color is not perfect. I wish to thank very much Pierre and his colleagues for this invitation for a debate with Randy Galistel. And I may say that I am extremely happy to have this dialogue, and I want to say from the beginning that I am not going to solve everything, but only contribute to some aspects of the neuroscience, which sometimes is a little bit forgotten from cognitive scientists. And the dialogue I had in the past, in particular with Jacques Meller, has been very productive, in particular with the outburst of Stanislas Dehaene, who is the best outcome of the debate between Jacques Meller and myself, and also by still some attempts today to link the molecular biology to higher brain function, and I would say to cognitive science. So I am glad that we can meet at least, and that I can convey a message which is that one of somebody who spent, I would say, nearly all his life to work at the molecular level, but I may say in the second part of his life to become very much interested by higher brain function, in particular access to consciousness, and that in close collaboration for 30 years with Stanislas Dehaene. And we are actually celebrated this year the anniversary of the Global Neuronal Workspace, 20 years of existence. So the approach have been developing these recent years is a system biology approach. What does it mean? It means that we are not only concerned by the brain itself and by the several levels of organization that you may find in the brain, which has very schematically presented here, from atom to molecule to cells to circuits to higher architectures of the brain, with, of course, the idea that it has an opening on social life, and the other one on I would say, consciousness and reasoning. And that these different levels of organization are not only considered from a bottom-up in blue, but also a top-down kind of organization. And I will try to illustrate at some stage how you may have a top-down action of cognition on molecular properties. And this is something which is, of course, of interest for all of us. Now, there is in this organization, of course, hierarchy that you can see here, and a lot of parallelism, and also diversification of multiple nested levels of integration, as I already mentioned. Now I want to say also that our brain is rooted in physical and chemical environments. It is itself chemistry, and I don't hesitate to say that the brain is a chemical machine, which is something that very few cognitive scientists are really concerned by. But in addition, even being a chemical machine, I just say, you can see here that I consider very seriously, and this is not always been done by electrophysiologists or those who are simply recording the brain, in particular in mouse, what we have been doing ourselves for decades. But I am critical about that by saying that if we really want to approach the human brain, we have to not only consider the issue of conscious processing and rational language, but also all the social life. Language is a system of social communication that we have to do it, and therefore that we have to consider that single image taken from a single individual brain are not satisfactory, because there is always a partner, and I am here speaking with you, all of you, and there is not only a social life, but in addition, what I call a cultural environment. I will further discuss that. So this system biology approach of the human brain does not want to omit any of these features, but on the opposite, take care of them and try to have them integrated into what could be called a system approach. Now, this way of looking at the brain, of course, does not exclude at all, but on the opposite, is considering modeling, that is use of mathematical constructs to try to match what we are looking at, and all the work we did with Stanislas Dehaene has been precisely that, to try to elaborate computer models of the human brain, but the human brain also can be viewed itself as a computer. And I think I don't share this view, and I think Randy Garistel may or may not. He will tell us our view. I think there is an enormous difference between all the computers that are presently being used, is that the human brain is autonomous, is self-organizing, and it's operating not in an input-output kind of way like any of these computers, and it is operating in what I called, and many others have called, the projective style. It's in fact constantly projecting representation on the outside world. Nevertheless, it has a considerable computational efficiency, and as I said, this computational efficiency is, if I may still say, highly original compared to what is actually done with present computers. The computers win sometimes the human brain because of their speed. They are working at the speed of light, and the human brain is still challenging the fastest computer working at the speed of light, even though it is working at the speed of sound, which is many orders of magnitude much slower than the actual computer that we are using. So there must be something special in the case of the human brain in the way it is built, and which makes this computational efficiency that we have to try to understand. I may say they are just, even though we have a lot of information about the brain, we are just starting to understand. And one way to look at the human brain is not just to look at the brain of the adult. And I have been fighting with this notion at the Human Brain Program. They want to make the map of the human brain. They make a map of the mouse brain. And they simply forget two things which are very obvious for all of us, that the human brain is the outcome of a long Darwinian evolution, first thing, and also the outcome of a long developmental process. And this is simply a view of a caricature of the question of the evolution of species in the case of the human brain. And what is extremely surprising is that there has been a very fast evolution of the human brain from, let's say, Australopithecus to Homo sapiens in, let's say, 1 million years, and of course, after many 100 million years of evolution of life on the Earth. But this one is particularly fast, and is, of course, associated with a variability of the genome and a Darwinian evolution. Now, I just mentioned the development, and we have to realize that humans is a rare species which spend almost half of its life to build its own brain. 15 years, even more, and even is continuing to develop after that. And this is in fact amazing that when Homo sapiens came out 300,000 years ago, then I am going to keep the time. We have to realize that Homo sapiens at that time in Africa was living about 30 years. So it has nevertheless been selected by Darwinian evolution to spend only half of his life with a mature brain, which is absolutely amazing and unique in the case of evolution. Now, during this evolution, as we shall see, there is also an evolution of the connectivity which is taking place, starting from the neurula very early on up to, as I said, the adolescence, and there are many nested steps of synaptic growth which are taking place, and at each of these steps there is some kind of exuberance and selection which is taking place, and this creates the possibility to have considerable interaction between the environment, and in particular the cultural environment, with the growth of the human brain architecture. And when we look at the adult, we should never forget that in the adult brain we are beyond millions of years of genetic evolution and years of developmental ontogenetic evolution. And now, as I already mentioned, there is some kind of dynamic of thought which is taking place there. And we may also say that at this stage there is some kind of Darwinian evolution, but of the level of the spontaneous activity and the change of properties of the connectivity and of the cell of the neurons as well, of course, but in a time range which is, of course, much faster than development and genetic evolution. And now there is the social and cultural evolution which are internalized into the brain through development, and which are also produced and stored in the outside world as extracerebral memories, and with which the adult is constantly interacting. And it goes from 100 milliseconds, the time scale of psychological activity, to thousands of years. Now, I want to say, as far as learning is concerned, that I myself consider that learning and memory is acting at all these levels. I am not going to be exclusive for any kind of level, and what I'm saying that these learning processes are operating with different time scales and different stabilities, and therefore for me this issue is a very important one, and I agree with Randy Gallistel about that. And I consider that we have to try to better understand this issue of learning and memory, but at all these steps I just mentioned already. Now, as I said initially, I'm essentially a molecular biologist, and I started my thesis work in the laboratory of Jacques Monod. And Jacques Monod at the time was working on the operon, and he wanted, together with François Jacob, that I work on the operon. I did not want. I said to them, I want to do things by my own, and I don't want to just do the work you are doing, perhaps better than what you are doing, but I want to do something else. So then there was a group of Umberger who in bacteria discovered that there is feedback inhibition. Here you have the pathway of biosynthesis of the amino acid isoleucine from threonine, and there are multiple steps, multiple chemical reactions, multiple enzymes, but there is one particular enzyme which is interesting for us, since it is feedback inhibited by the end product of the pathway, which is isoleucine. And you can see here that there is such inhibition which is taking place. There are also some cooperative effects which are being noticed. And therefore, this is a very particular kind of enzyme compared to all the other enzymes of the pathway. And I was attracted by this for several reasons. I am not going to make a philosophy of my adolescence, but I found this was extremely interesting and decided to work on it. And the first thing I thought about, which is evident, is that there was a special device in this renin deaminase so that it could respond to the feedback inhibitor, and which makes the difference with all these other enzymes. And therefore, try to separate activity of the enzyme, which is monitored here, and feedback inhibition, which is monitored here, since this is the inhibition by isoleucine, and find conditions where one can uncouple the feedback inhibition from the activity of the enzyme. And this was also found in parallel by Gerhardt and Pardee with another enzyme, aspartate transcarbamylase. So it means that there are some organization in the architecture of the protein molecule such that it confers not only feedback inhibition but also a threshold mechanism which make this reaction sensitive to low concentration of the signaling molecule, which is here the feedback inhibitor. So having done this by myself, Jacques Monod invited me to give a presentation at the Cold Spring Harbor mechanism in 1961, a very long time ago. And in this paper that I wrote by myself, he did not want to co-author it because he was not closely enough involved. He was a very honest kind of boss, which is not anymore the case, but sometimes so much. And he decided, well, this is your discovery. You should publish that by yourself. So, and I proposed this kind of model here, where to account for the effect of isoleucine, then instead of having overlapping sites, steric hindrance, we would have topographically distinct sites being mediated by a change of conformation of the protein. So this is the model 2, I call no overlapping, and in the concluding remarks of the Cold Spring Harbor meeting, then Monod and Jacob found a very nice name. He discussed that with me, but credit should be given for the name they proposed, which goes also with the concept, the word allosteric, which has been very successful. So this is the definition of an allosteric interaction. And of course, following on my thesis work, I tried also to not only to account for the interaction between topographically distinct sites, as you can see here, but also between identical sites, and have an interpretation, a molecular interpretation of the property of the renin deaminase as a switch, a molecular switch, all or none switch. And we proposed, Monod, Wyman, and myself, that in fact these molecules were present under two states, and that this state would pre-exist to the binding of ligand, and what threonine or isolated would do would to shift the equilibrium in one direction or into the other. So this is again some kind of selectionist, Darwinian, if I may say, molecular mechanism where the ligand does not induce the conformational change, but on the opposite, select a state which pre-exists. And this was some kind of revolution, if I may say, because, you know, everybody always thinks about learning, for instance, as something where the environment push things into the organism. And here it's exactly the opposite. The organism built in itself within what Plato already had some insight on that the things are being built from the inside, and that the interaction with the outside world is simply to stabilize things which are already in it. So this is the way we view this model, and assign the cooperativity to the cooperative organization of the protein, which would be some kind of microcrystal and have these two all-or-none states, which would be preferentially stabilized by the ligand. So this is a model which is very simple, which accounts for many of the data I accumulated during my thesis work about the cinetic property of threonine deaminase. And a few years later, here it's exactly 20 years later, or at least, the group of Iwata was able to co-crystallize within the same crystal the two conformation states of this allosteric enzyme, lactate dehydrogenase, that you find in the yogurt when you with Bifidobacterium longum. And I don't want to say that this is the enzyme is essential for the nutritionist qualities of the yogurt, but it is a very efficient bacteria. And here you have the two conformations which have been identified, and more interestingly, this change of quaternary organization is a very simple one. We have an oligomer, with several subunits like that, which are associated. And the conformation change is some kind of twist which is taking place, where the ligand, the substrate, and the regulatory ligand are at the interface between subunits. Here you see that clearly, the catalytic site. And here you see the site from the regulatory molecule, fructose and 6-D-phosphate. So we have an extremely interesting feature where nature, through a very simple-minded evolution, have been able to build up this kind of molecule. And this is, of course, fully in agreement with our scheme. And in the end of my thesis work, again, I wanted to put that by myself. I did. In the conclusion of my thesis work, I said that possibly what is true for threonine deaminase is also true for synaptic transmission in the brain. And then I decided not only to write it in the thesis, but to do it. And I went to, at that time, to David Nachmanson in Columbia University, where I wanted to work on a system which was extremely well studied by David Nachmanson, which is the neuromuscular junction that you can see here, where the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And the electric organ of a fish is, in fact, an immense collection, billion of such synapses, which are all identical, and therefore we have an extremely homogeneous tissue, which is, of course, the ideal for a biochemist to identify a receptor protein. So the thing is that the neurotransmitter, now it's no longer isoleucine, acetylcholine, is in fact acting on the muscle at the level of receptor and create a change of electrical properties, which is due to an increased permeability to cations here, sodium and potassium. So the proposal was that the allosteric two-state model would apply to a molecule where there would be a site for the neurotransmitter, and the active site would be the channel. And here, soon after, there was the work of Neher and Sackman making patch clamp recordings, and you can see how it looks. Look at the time scale. This is a millisecond, and the time scale of the rise of permeability that you can see as a decline is in the microsecond time scale. So we are here at a system which is operating in, as you can see here, in the millisecond time scale, and which is, of course, impose a constraint which is dramatic to the processing of any kind of information in the brain. So that's the reason why the brain is so slow. Okay, so the receptor was isolated through the electric organ of fish, toxin from snake venom, which are highly sensitive labels, and selective. And here, this is the first view of the postsynaptic membrane in the electric organ, where you see the molecule of receptors, and see already that this is some kind of pentameric organization. And to make a very long story short, this is a higher resolution view by Nigel Unwin of the receptor with the site for acetylcholine, which are 40 angstrom distant, and the ion channel here, which is 60 angstrom distant from the active site. So if there is an interaction between these two categories of site, it has to be allosteric. So this means that we need to understand the allosteric transition at the atomic level of this receptor to really have a view about signal transduction in the brain. Now, the interesting thing we did, and this was done by Pierre-Jean Coringer in my lab. This was almost a few months before I had to close my lab because I was too old, and I'm still speaking. It's okay. And then I was a reviewer of a paper by a pure guy doing systematic sequencing in bacteria, in making sequences. And this guy discovered that there were in bacteria some sequences which look a little bit like the nicotinic receptor sequence. So when I read that, I may say I immediately accepted the paper, who was published very soon, and I asked Pierre-Jean, go ahead, this is the way for us to crystallize the receptor and have the structure, because up to now, with the electric organ receptor, we failed. So Pierre-Jean did that, was able to show that GLIC is a ligand-gated ion channel, which is already present in bacteria. This was also done in parallel by Ilf and Dutzer. And following this, there were receptors identified not only in bacteria, but also now in eukaryote. And there are eukaryotic receptors which have been crystallized and structure is known. And even the nicotinic receptor very recently by the group of Moraes Pires. So we are, in fact, in a position to say that not only the bacterial receptors are at the origin of the nicotinic receptor gene family, but that we have in our brain receptors which are, as you can see here, extremely similar to the bacterial receptor. And we are slow thinkers because we are in the lineage, we are the descendants of bacteria who invented the receptor we have in our brain. Now, the other thing I want to say is that this is, of course, for us a beautiful tool to study the pharmacology of receptors in the brain. But in addition, I just want to mention that because this is also a way to link with higher brain function, as you shall see in a minute, is that there are, in addition, sites which are regulating the efficacy of the allosteric transition and the linkage between neurotransmitter site and ion channel. But these are other sites that you can see here, and in particular, site in the transmembrane domain. And here is the case of ivermectin, which is a compound which is a vermifuge, but acting also on nicotinic receptor here in the brain of birds, but also of humans and also of worms. And you can see that this is increasing, this compound here is increasing the efficacy of the response to acetylcholine more than 20-fold. And this is an extremely interesting property, and this was discovered with Daniel Bertrand. And now the localization of this site in the transmembrane domain has been investigated both by Pierre-Jean Coringer, my former collaborator, now independent, and he found that there is also an effect of the general anesthetics on the property of this receptor as the GABA receptor. And you can see here the site for the general anesthetic here in the transmembrane domain, as in the case of ivermectin in the transmembrane domain. And this is extremely interesting because, as you know, if there is some compound acting on consciousness, in what I call the chemistry of consciousness, is of course the general anesthetics. And you can really understand the effects of general anesthetics, not exclusively by, but very strongly on the basis of an allosteric effect on some receptors present in the brain, and in particular the GABA receptor. And if we potentiate the effect of GABA on the GABA receptor, you potentiate inhibition in the brain, and you potentiate inhibition in the cortex so much that the subject starts to sleep. So this and have the effect of general anesthesia. So there is a clear link between the allosteric property, the receptor, and higher brain function. And now we have, of course, been very much concerned by the allosteric transition of this receptor, doing molecular dynamics, and just have the two crystallized states for the closed and open state of the receptor from GLIC. And you can see that the kind of simulation that we can have of this allosteric transition using molecular dynamics. And clearly, the conclusion at this stage is, he does not want to go, here it is, that not only there is a bacterial origin of the receptor channel in the brain, synaptic transmission, but also that this is imposing a bottom-up constraints upon human brain function up to cognition, and in particular the so-called psychological time scales, which is about 100 milliseconds, is simply due to the fact that you have a chain of not only propagation due to the allosteric transition of ion channel, but also synaptic transmission, release and action of the neurotransmitter on this receptor. So again, it is possibly explained why the human brain is working at the speed of sound and the computer at the speed of light. So having this being said, of course one can build up on this regulation of synapse efficacy, and have in addition, which is well known from Katz and Teslev, in addition to the resting and active state, we have also some slowly desensitized states. And I want to say two things. First of all, that mutation of these receptors in the brain, and there are nicotinic receptors in the brain, of course, and in particular of the alpha-4 subunit, is able to create an autosomal dominant frontal lobe epilepsy in children. And therefore, this is an additional link between the molecular level and the, if I may say, the cognitive level. But aware of that, one can, of course, try to make a computational model of this allosteric transition and its regulation by another synapse, have, for instance, what we call a synaptic triad, where the allosteric transition between resting and desensitized is modulated by another synapse through a reversible or covalent reaction, which is changing this allosteric equilibrium. And I am pleased to say that all the work that we have done and still do with Stanislas is based on this kind of scheme, and that having this kind of regulation at the synaptic level, one can build networks having a very elaborate architectures, a model of birdsong, learning as a thing, and also a model of development of numerical activity, subitizing. And I may say that I was at that time, which is almost 20 years ago, willing that Stanislas and myself keep going with numbers in the conscious workspace, and in between political aspects have been involved, but I hope that we shall keep going and do it one day. So now I am late, but I also continue on the molecular level, and this other aspect, which is the relationship between the simplicity of the genome and the complexity of the brain. I mentioned already from Australopithecus to Homo sapiens in maybe 2 million years, very short period of time, very few modification at the gene level. And for those who are doing cognitive science and who dislike to work on the mouse, and as I do, I have been working with the mouse for so many years, maybe a little bit tired of it, but when you compare the number of genes in the mouse and in humans, you find exactly the same. So there are perhaps 1.2 difference of sequences between chimps and humans, but there is what I called an astonishing evolutionary parsimony, in the sense that we can build a very complex human brain compared to the mouse brain, and nevertheless has only very few genetic changes taking place at the level of the genome. And nevertheless, they do exist, and we have to understand them. And just to want to introduce again Jacob and Monod, and wish to say that when they made their scheme in 61, I was working at the same time, as you remember, in allostery, and then they put here some RNA for the repressor acting on the operator and regulating in cis the transcription and traduction of the protein. And I may say that it was revisited by Monod and Jacob, and thanks to the work I did on allosteric protein, the idea came out that the receptor was possibly an allosteric protein also, binding to the DNA in one hand and binding to the lactose on the another domain. And yet, indeed, the repressor is an allosteric protein. It's a transcription factor, which is an allosteric protein, which structure is known from Lewis. And here you can see all these transcription factors which are acting on the machine. It's a very nice car here, which is the transcription machine, which is acting here, from the operator, and regulating the transcription from DNA to messenger RNA. So these transcription factors here are multiple on a single transcription machine, and from that, together with an excellent colleague I met in San Diego, Igor Tsigelny, we proposed the idea that possibly this transcription factor should be able to make networks, and that therefore we could build gene assemblies which could themselves be regulated by ligands binding to these transcription factors. This is not pure theory. Here, these are the rat data for genes which are being expressed in the developing cortex of the rat, and the correlation between these gene expression make maps where transcription factors would be able to regulate this correlated expression of maps and have some kind of hierarchical expression of transcription factors taking place during development within, of course, the cell body, and may have even at this stage of transcription or also transduction the possibility to have a top-down modulation of the transcription itself by the higher level activity acting at the level of the cell body. So this is a way to try now to understand the relationship between gene parsimony. I am very fast on that, I'm sorry. Gene parsimony and the cognitive properties of the brain by looking at the relationship between gene mutations and cognitive disease, and one which has been extremely studied is autism, in particular in Pasteur by Thomas Bourgeron. And the very interesting finding is instead of having one gene for autism, there might be some monogenic disease. They exist indeed, some of them. But here, the very fascinating thing is that he found that there are up to 500 predisposition genes to autism. In the case of schizophrenia, is 100, even more, with associated genetic loci. So our way of looking at this is that you may have the same phenotype, which is altered, like a social phenotype, in the case of schizophrenia and autism, and which is in fact being, this will be my last slide, being under the control of brain structure, which are themselves under the control of a plethora of genes which have been involved in the development of the brain architecture in general, and therefore that you have in fact these networks of transcription factors which are being involved, and there is the link, as I said, with the environment which is taking place. Again, I repeat myself, at the level of this allosteric transition of the transcription factors during the setting of this connectivity. So when our excellent friend Pinker say, oh, I have found the MAT gene, I have found the syntax gene, and now it is the FOXP2 and the language gene, I say simply, this is wrong. I'm sorry to say that in front of such a distinguished audience, but the proposal I want to make is that there are networks of gene interactions which are taking place in the course of the development of the brain, which code for the innate disposition of the human brain and for their modulation by their environment and their deficit. It's, if I may say, some typical, according to me, molecular memory. I don't know if Randy is going to agree on that or not. He will discuss that. Now I have few things to say now, which is, of course, in between the gene and the brain architecture. First of all, the issue of epigenesis. I already discussed that, and most of you are aware of this. The fact that after birth, you remember the slide I showed, the growth, there is an enormous growth of synapse, and when you look in the eyes of your son or grandson, as I am, for 1 second, how many synapses do form during 1 second? I gave the answer there. 1 million synapses. So it means that all of you working on the child have to be aware that when they end the experiment, the brain of the child is not the same as the one they started with. So that there is, even in very simple experiments with babies, always the fear that you are not working with the same brain at the beginning and the end of the experiment. Now, of course, you have to realize that the developing brain of the child is a fantastic system where synapses are growing and being stabilized all the time. It's an enormous jungle of synapse connections which are being established. Remember that it's 10 to the 15 synapses, and almost half of them are being made after birth. So it's an enormous development which keeps going in the adult, and the proposal we made with Courrèges and Danchin is that there are some nested steps of development which are taking place during this whole period, many steps nested within each other, and that there are, of course, critical periods for active elimination of synapses or pruning. This is an American word, but in French it does not look good because a prune is a fruit that we like very much, and which is, in addition, can be put with Armagnac, and the pruneau, which is even much better because there is an alcohol in it. But so the British and the American like pruning. I prefer elimination, but it's okay. So the idea is that to learn is to eliminate. I proposed that many years, and that the activity and the environments regulate the stabilization, elimination of synapses. We made a formal model for that many years ago in '73. And here are some of the biochemical events which are controlling synapse elimination, and the nicotinic receptor, of course, and the GABA neuron, the trophic factors, and so on and so forth. So just an example to show that one can control this epigenesis through single gene mutation, dealing with the nicotinic receptor, of course. So we built these mice with a knockout of the alpha-4 beta-2 subunit of the nicotinic receptor. You can see here the disappearance of the binding of an homologue of nicotine. And in these mice, we look at the selective stabilization of the visual pathway, the Hubel and Wiesel experiment. I'm sure all of you know about that. And for binocularity to develop. And here, just 1 or 2 slides just to tell you that indeed, when you look at the knockout mouse, in the geniculate body, there is indeed a very striking effect of the deletion of the beta-2 receptor. And in the superior colliculus, it's even stronger, as you can see here. You can see that here there is a deficit in the synaptic elimination compared to that, which is absolutely obvious there. So the conclusion is that there is an effect of nicotinic receptor on the modulation of the development of the visual pathways and the selective elimination of synapses. And of course, one is tempted to say that this is also happening in humans, and in particular in the case of a learning task, which is writing and reading. And this is a cultural task. It's something which is not natural I would say reading, and reading is against nature. And nevertheless, yes, it is. Yes, the system is such that during development, in fact, as I illustrated, there is a necessary interaction with the outside world which is taking place. This is not the recuperation or reshuffling or whatever. This is simply imprinting of the environment into the developing brain. And you can see the brain of a literate. This was done by Martin Ingvar many years ago. This has been repeated by Dehaene and his group. And there is a good agreement with the early finding of Ingvar and Katso-Caldas. And the idea is that this epigenetic influence is extremely important in the building up of the adult brain. And therefore, I am very much in line with Vygotsky's view that, in fact, there is, during development, an internalization of the social and cultural worlds through the selective stabilization of synapses. Last, I will conclude on that. What about conscious processing? And there have been, I am going to be a little bit fast because time is passing. There have been a lot of studies on sleep and wakefulness. And there have also been studies, in particular by Jasper and colleagues, who have been working on epilepsy, that there are mechanisms involved in not only the state of consciousness, but the content of processes. And Bars proposed a global workspace, which is a physical space where, when we have inputs from different modalities, we have a unique perception of the world. And you are presently using, when you listen to me, to sound, to vision, and also to the memories you have stored in your brain, which are shared in a common physical space. So the proposal that we made with Michel Kersberg and Stanislas Dehaene was from observation I took from my teaching course at the Collège de France, that already Ramon y Cajal had shown that there are neurons with long-range axons. This was also present in Dejerine. You see all the white matter fascicles here in the human brain. And also from the work of Patricia Goldman-Rakish, that you have long-range circuits between prefrontal, parieto-temporal, cingulate cortex. And this is even also seen in the recent work of Kennedy and Van de Sen. So there is an hypothesis. This is an hypothesis, very simple-minded, too simple to be perfectly true. It's that through this long-range connectivity, which makes recurrent network, there is a physical workspace where there is processing of information, and we call it ignition, and this is a way we feel that the subject become aware of what's happening in this global workspace. You know this scheme. What I want to emphasize is that this scheme, the representation, not only mobilize the cortical areas themselves, but also the thalamic ones, and as I said, multiple cortical areas into one global representation. And this is something which, of course, is of importance, but may be criticized, of course. And you may have to distinguish between a conscious and non-conscious kind of representations. And I would like to say that this is a very simple scheme which was put as a formal mathematical model with Michel Kersberg in 1998. And we tried to make a model of the Stroop task. I'm sure I'm not teaching this kind of task to those who are present here. And you know that you ask the subject to name the color of the ink of this color word, yellow. So yellow is the word, but you should answer red, of course, which is the color of the ink. And so the subject is making mistakes. And the idea is that, again, you have a Darwinian mechanism by selection taking place here. And that there is a reward which lead to the, you remember, the projective style of the brain. So the subject, the spontaneous activity is wandering from one representation to the other. And then when it matches with the kind of operation which is adequate by the subject, then there is selective stabilization through an allosteric modulation of this. This has been extensively described as a model, and this could be further discussed about the combinatorial power which we may find in the global neuronal workspace. And just to illustrate that during this Stroop task, the model shows that there is, of course, routine processing, then a search phase for the subject when it is submitted to the task, and where the global neuronal workspace begins firing, and then the routine processing, where there is much less intense activity in the global neuronal workspace. And these are the predictions that we made in our first paper. And in between, there have been some brain imaging studies which fit with this kind of scheme. But of course, these are very, very global kind of correlations which can be made between the model and the brain imaging. Now, last but not least, we, when I say it's Sergent and Dehaene in their Neurospin lab, who has been following in a masking task the ignition I just mentioned before. And very interesting, they see this P300 wave. Look at the time scale here, which is also self-sustained. And this has been confirmed by Rolf Sema recently. So this is non-conscious, this is conscious. And the interesting thing is that the last experiment we did with the mouse, you find some spontaneous activity which we compare to this kind of ignition, but in the absence of interaction with the outside world, routine interaction, if I may say. And the very fascinating thing is that if you knock out the nicotinic receptor, they are completely modified. And going further, we can propose just a link between these nicotinic receptor data and some models we built of cortical inhibition, just which would cause hypofrontality in the mouse and possibly in the brain. So in humans, so this is a way to link chemistry and cognition. And last but not least, last slide. The idea that we want to propose is that in the case of autism that I presented already with these multi-genes, in fact, the long-range connectivity would be altered. And you see here the tracks with abnormal growth in autistic infants, and they are in white here. So this is, of course, a very interesting situation. And the possibility is, in fact, that all these multiple genes affect the development of the long-range connectivity, which itself would be engaged in the alteration of the social phenotype. And there are some preliminary image of brain imaging which go with this hypothesis. So, just to conclude, that we are far, very far from understanding the link between the molecular level and the cognitive level in a system biology kind of approach. But at least we can envisage in the future to have closer interaction between the different levels of organization in the brain and have multidisciplinarity involved between these different disciplines and try to account for this fascinating non-linear relationship between the evolution of the genome and the evolution of the brain that we still do not understand, even if we know that we have 5% of our genes from the Neanderthal. But this is something that we have to further understand. These are the main actors. You recognize Pierre-Jean Coranger, Marina Picciotto, Stanislas, Sylvain Mascos, and that's is the last. Do you like my brain? I don't know. Thank you very much. So I think we have discussion later on. Huh? Yeah.